Hi and welcome to another From Scratch Unity 5 tutorial. This is the second one in the series that I'm creating, and today we're going to look at materials. If you want any color in your scene, you're going to have materials. So materials contain all the color information, all the special effects information for the surfaces of objects, and all of their texture details as well. So first of all, we're going to look at some really basics materials, which is just setting the colors of objects. Okay, so let's create some spheres. So I've created a basic Unity project for 3D, and we will create a sphere in the scene. So in the hierarchy, let's right click, create 3D object sphere. And we have our standard sphere mesh that you can see there. Now, if we select it in the hierarchy and have a look in the inspector, at the very bottom you'll find what material is attached to it. In this case, it's a default material. The default material comes with every object that you add, primitive object that you add into your game view. You can't change the default material, you can't edit it. So if you want to add some new effects onto the surface, you need to create your own material. So to do that, we go to the Project tab. Inside Assets, we're going to create a new material. Now I could create the material just in here, but I'm not going to do that. A better way is to first of all create a folder and call that Materials, and then create your materials inside of this. It just helps to keep your project all nice and organized so that you can find the objects that you're looking for. You can also search through favorite objects, so you can actually restrict what you're seeing to just the materials, models, etc. in this project view. So this will just organize things for you. And then if you were to look in the folder, the assets folder on your computer, you'll see a materials folder in there. Now, as I emphasized in the first tutorial, you don't want to go looking at these folders from anywhere else other than inside Unity. So let's double click on the materials folder so we know that we're in there. And we go create, let's right click, create, and go down to material. So the material will come up. Now it's going to be the bog standard material again, and it's going to be white. We want to call this material red, for reasons that will become very obvious in a moment, if not already. So if we go back to our sphere, we've still got our standard material on it. To attach this material to our object, we can drag it from the project onto the object inside the scene, or we can drop it in the inspector. It doesn't matter which way you choose. So I've dropped it in the inspector. Now you can see that this red material has been added to the sphere. If we click on the material in the project to get hold of its properties in the inspector, you'll see a number of different settings, properties that we can set to make this material look different. The first one we're going to look at is called the albedo. The albedo is the color of the object itself. It's its base color. So when all other things are not turned on, lighting and all things like that, it's the object's color. We've called this material red, so let's make it red. To set the albedo, click on the box that's currently white, and a little box will appear that you can then set the color by dragging around inside of this window. You can also set the color using its red, green and blue and alpha channels as well. Alpha is for when you want to have some transparency in your color. Now if we set this to full on red, because that's what we've called it red, and then we just close this window, we now have a nice red sphere. I'm just going to create another couple of spheres so we can see what's going on. Okay, so I've created a new sphere. Now it's created with the default color, and I can create another sphere which is a duplicate. If you use Control D, you'll see that I've got sphere number 2 And I've now got that one. I'll just put that over there so that we can see it. Okay, so this sphere has the red material, this one has the default, and this one has the default. If we want to make this sphere here red, we can just grab that red material and put it onto here. Okay, let's say that we want to make this sphere blue. Your first impulse might be to go into here and change it to blue. But see what it does? It also changes this sphere as well, because both of these objects have that material on them. You don't just paint something with a material and then it's forgotten about. So it's a live attribute that if you change any game object's material, if that same material is on any other game object, it will also change. So if you want to have these two spheres different colors, you need to have another material. Let's leave that one at blue, but select this here, Control D will give you a duplicate, and we will call this one, let's call this one blue. Let's go back to the red and actually make it red. Okay, again, it's still applied to both of these. Let's make that one blue. We just grab this blue material and we put it on there. And now we edit these separately for when we want to change those colors. So that's the albedo setting. Next, let's look at the metallic. We'll use the red material. Okay, and after albedo, you can set metallic. Metallic allows the surface to become extra shiny, as you would expect with metal. So if we take this up to full metallic, we can also set the smoothness. So if you've got a matte metallic object, it doesn't tend to be as shiny. But if you set the smoothness up to like really smooth, you can see that you start to get the same effect you would expect of lighting on a metallic surface. So I put this right up high. Then the point light, which is the light in our scene, this directional light here, is shining onto this spot here, giving us that really nice shiny highlight on this red color. If I just zoom out a little bit and we select the light, go into the scene and press the F key, we'll be able to see where our light is. So this light is a directional light, and it's casting rays down in this direction. You can imagine a directional light's like the sun. It's pretty much everywhere. So it doesn't matter where you put it. As you can see, I can even put it underneath objects and they still get lit the same way. I'll just move this up and come in a bit. So it's not affecting how those objects are lit. What matters is the direction that this light is coming from. And if I hit the E key with selecting the light and move it around, zoom in a bit for you, you can see that the lighting on the surface of those objects is affected by that directional light. And then you can also see where this little point of specular lighting is coming from in that metallicness of the red. And also notice there's no metallicness on the blue, so it's still same kind of a matte, but you're still getting the shaded shadow effects on those objects. More often than not, you'll want to put a material onto an object that has more detail in what it looks like than just color. When you need to do this, you have to use textures. A texture is an image file that you've created in Photoshop or Illustrator or some other paint program. So to illustrate this process, I'm going to bring in some of the textures that I downloaded from the Asset Store. If you're not familiar with the Unity Asset Store, you can find it under Window Asset Store, and that will take you to Unity's own store when you can buy all sorts of things. These are all the packages I've bought in the past. I've just purchased an old bricks texture that we'll be using for this, but you can also look for things. especially textures. If we go down to textures and materials, and then you go to bricks, there was a free one. If you sort by price, yeah, this one here. If you want to play around with different texture resolutions, feel free to download this one here and look for the image files in it, and then you can replicate what I'm about to do now. Let's go back to the scene. Now I'll just go to the high level of the asset store, and I'll drag in the textures that I downloaded previously. They're just sitting on my desktop. I can just bring the whole folder in and dump it there, and that will bring in all of these new textures I'm going to use. Okay, so first of all we need something to put the textures on, and these are brick textures, so I'm going to create a ground which will be a cube. So there's the cube. I'm going to move it down, and I'm going to resize it a bit. Make it nice and big for us, like that, and rotate the scene around. Kind of look at it from a bit of a different angle so we can get a really good look at the texture. Right, so we need to create a new material that we're going to put onto this ground. So create new material in our materials folder, and we'll call it ground. And then we drag and drop ground onto the ground cube that we made. Okay, to see that that has occurred, if we select our cube, which is over in the hierarchy, I might just rename that ground so we remember. You'll see that that ground material is now attached to it. To put a texture onto that ground material, select the ground material, and we'll go over to the albedo setting. Instead of setting color this time, we're going to put a texture in here. And we're going to use this old bricks texture, which is this one here. If you have a look at these files, they have different extensions on the names. This one's old bricks 01 diff, diff standing for diffuse. This one here, which has NM, means normal map, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the diffuse map, which you would put in your albedo setting, is the basic color of the surface. So just like we set red or blue, green, yellow, this one's actually got multiple colors because it's using a texture, but it's still the basic coloring that's on that surface. So it goes in the albedo. Once upon a time, in the old versions of Unity, that albedo was called diffuse. So if you're familiar with the old Unity, just be aware that this albedo is the same thing. Now, you've got a color setting as well that you can then apply. If I wanted to make those bricks a bit redder, I can add color over the top of the texture. I can make them bluer, but I'm just going to leave them at their actual color. So we want to put white, because white won't interfere with the color that's currently there in that texture map. Now this texture map has been applied to a flat surface. Okay, it's a flat surface of the cube, and if we just move around a bit, you can see it's very flat. It hasn't taken on any of the geometry of these bricks. If you were to touch this real brick surface, you imagine there'd be lots of bumps and grooves and roughness on it, but it's just an image, so it's flat, and it basically looks pretty flat. So we need to fake some height in this. But before I go on to how to do that, I just want to explain a few of the concepts going on behind the scenes that make the next few steps actually work. Now imagine this is our cube, or any model that's in our Unity environment. A model is basically a mesh, and it's made up of a whole bunch of triangles. In this case it's squares, but in Unity it tends to be triangles. Each one of these little single polygon planes we'll have what are called normals. And we represent normals with straight lines like this, with an arrow on the end, that come out of the plane at 90 degrees. The side of the polygon that has the normal sticking out of it is the side that you can see. It's the side that gets drawn. The side without the normal doesn't get drawn. So the inside of this cube, for example, doesn't have any substance. You couldn't see anything. We'll revisit this concept a little later when we look at models. But just for now, know that the surfaces you're looking at have these 90-degree normals on them. The normals are used by the game engine to determine what the surface is going to look like. So based on where our camera is, which I will illustrate here with a little eye, which is looking at it from a certain angle, and based on where the light is, which is also casting light rays down at a certain angle on our object. By taking the intersection of a light ray with our normal, we get a little angle, and then we use that in coordination with the angle that we're looking at the surface from as well. And this angle determines on how intense that surface is to you, to your camera, what it's going to look like. On a flat plane, all of this whole surface, because all of the normals of each of these little planes is exactly the same, is that the whole surface will be treated the same. If we switch back to Unity, we can see this effect if we add a new cube. So I'll just add very quickly a cube with no surface treatment on it whatsoever except the default material. If we rotate that cube around and then just get in a little closer to it, you can see the surfaces, how they're treated differently based on where the sun is coming from and where we're looking at it. This surface here, although it might be made up of a whole bunch of polygons, which in this case it's only made of two because you can see the two triangles there, but even if it was a bigger mesh with many more little subdivisions on it, all the normals are facing in the same way. So when they get coloured exactly the same, and so you get this flat shading across the whole surface. And the same thing on these sides here. You can see that they're shaded all the same shade of grey, and this one here is shaded all the same shade of grey as well. Circles are different because each of the little flat planes that make up this entire sphere, if we just click on the sphere, you can actually see those planes. Just move this up and come in closer. They're all on a slightly different angle to each other. All of the normals coming out of here are still at 90 degrees, okay, but because they're all curved, they end up being shaded in a more rounded fashion. Right, so that's what's going on with the normals. I'll delete that cube. The same thing, because our ground is essentially a cube with a texture on it, is being lit and treated the same way. So the light coming off of this surface is coming off of all these normals that are the same, and it's very, very flat. And you can see that there. So to create or fake some height in this, we can add what's called a normal map. And if we get back to our material, which is our ground material, the next one you'll see in the properties for that is a normal map. So let's add the normal map that came with the old bricks. Normal map will always look this blue color, so they're very easy to find. Did you see what happened to our surface when I added the normal map? I'll turn it off and then I add it again. It suddenly created depth where there was none before, and in fact there's still no depth at all if we rotate back around again and look at that surface from low, you can see it's still flat. It's an optical illusion. And that optical illusion is being created by this normal map. So what's actually happening with our normals is that instead of using the normals that come with the mesh, we end up getting all these faked normals. The normal map, the texture itself, is changing these normals. And by changing these normals and adding all of these weird directional normals all over the surface, then we get different angles where the light is hitting the texture and where it's going off to the camera. And that essentially creates shadows and bumps in an image where there are none. So it's a really nice way of faking it. But because of all the calculations that have to occur by adding a normal map, it adds a little extra processing to your final game. Of course, if you're working on a fast machine, you're never going to notice these sorts of things, but do be careful when you start adding these effects for mobile games because it will slow the performance down a little. So where a normal map will give you the illusion of height and actual sort of raised texture where there is none, it's not giving you an occlusion, which means as I dip down here, if this brick was higher than this brick, you'd imagine that this brick would be occluded or hidden behind this brick. A normal map can't do that. What can do that is a height map. The height map, which is here in our ground material and provided as a grayscale image, we can add that in. Okay, now the effect is very minimal with a very low height, but I can change that height by moving this dial. Look what's happening to the texture. We're now getting an even better illusion that our texture is quite bumpy. If we come right down low and look at it, you can see it still has absolutely no extra geometry, no bumps at all. It's all hidden. But the height map allows for occluding so that higher bricks will actually, and you can start to see the little divots in there, will hide the other bricks that are behind them. This is also manipulating the normals on the surface of that texture. And as you can imagine, also adds extra processing. But it does give you a much nicer effect, and it is a lot cheaper way of having geometry and depth in objects where there actually is none, as opposed to modeling all of these bricks separately and having those in your scene. So if you have a large castle interior or exterior for that matter, and you want to make it look quite bumpy and rough with bricks, then this is the way you would do it. You wouldn't model them into the actual architecture of the model. So these are some great things to include with your material. The next property in a material is occlusion that you can see here. And what occlusion does is allows you to control the amount of light that is falling on the surface at certain parts. So rather than the light being treated the same way across the entire surface, which it already isn't because of all of the other maps that we've added, we can also add an occlusion which will give you even more depth. The occlusion, which is a pretty much black and white image that you can see here. The white parts are where you want most of the light, and the grey parts is where you want less light showing. So if we go back to our material for ground and find the occlusion and set that to there, you can see that that popped a little. As far as making it look deeper. The occlusion, you can also change the amount that is being applied, and you can see that quite subtly. If we put it down to 0, that we've got nothing of that image being applied, and then at 1 we've got all of it. And you can see the shadows getting darker and the tops of those bricks becoming lighter. So that just gives you even more depth. Although this is not everything there is to know about materials, I just want to show you one more thing before we end this tutorial that you might be interested in. As you see, I've updated the scene to include a couple of walls and a roof. I've just duplicated the floor and rotated it around to make a cheap and nasty room, which will give us some shadows in which those 3 balls we had before are now placed. And you'll see they're in full shadow. To make an object glow, if you wanted to, say, create a computer monitor in your scene that has a light that casts its colours onto the other surfaces, or an exit sign or traffic lights or something like that, you can use this technique of emissive lighting. Let's grab our red material and look back down through the properties, and you'll see an emission. We set emission to the colour we want to emit, and that's going to be bright red, and you can see the ball immediately starts to glow. Now, it's not hitting the other surfaces as of yet because you need to do a few things in order for it to be processed. The first thing you want to do is set the sphere that's glowing to static. So in the inspector, up in this top corner, we're going to click static. And then the surface that's receiving the light needs to be static as well. So that's this ground plane, the first ground, or I should say cube, that we created. We want to set that to static as well. Once we've done that, we will get a red glow, which you can kind of see there, maybe not as obvious. So if I go back to the sphere and its red material, I can set that glow. Let's turn this up to say 5, and it will now glow like that. Let me move this in real time and recalculate an update for you. So you can see it casting that red glow from itself there. Let's do it with the blue ball as well. Set it to static. And let's go to the blue and add a blue emission. Actually, just for interest's sake, let's add a green emission to it. So you can have a different color to the albedo for an object. And let's turn that emission up a little bit. And as we do that, you can see that it's affecting it. I'm going to set that to 5 by hand. And you can now see that you've got that glow as well. On this back wall, you need to set that to static. We can set these other 2 walls to static as well. Down in the bottom corner, you'll see that it's doing a bit of calculations, which could take some time to based on how many models that you've got in the scene. But once it's done, you'll have your glowing effects from all sides. Okay, and then we can see the final output of that rendering. So you've got both of those spheres now fully illuminating the scene, a nice glow effect. Okay, that's all I've got time for in this tutorial because it's starting to draw on for a bit longer than I hoped for, and there's still a lot of things about materials that we'll cover in later tutorials. So I hope you've learnt something about materials, and yeah, good luck with your Unity projecting. See you next time.